Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about what happened conversations. A what happened conversation is a type of conversation that is incredibly useful when you are in a difficult or resentful or angry or frustrated situation with someone, or even when you just know that you need to deliver difficult feedback in a corporate setting. Today I want to talk about what a what happened conversation is and why it's useful, how to do it, including some scripts, when to do it, and also some common mistakes or concerns I hear and how to avoid them or address those concerns. And before we get into any of that, I just want to say, have you enjoyed my podcast? If so, would you consider pausing this podcast really fast and giving it a quick rating, or even, if you were feeling very generous, a 1-sentence review on your podcast app of choice? Look, I know that we've all heard this request before from other podcasts, and if I am being honest, I often ignore it, even though it would only take a minute or less, because honestly, I think to myself, oh, it doesn't really matter. My little review, it doesn't matter. And look, in some contexts for huge podcasts, I think that could be true. You know, they have 10,000 listeners, they have 100,000 listeners per episode, but guys, this is not a huge podcast. Right now, there are honestly just a few hundred of you who listen to every episode. So your review and rating actually does make a really big difference. So I would just say if I've given you 20 minutes of usefulness or 2 hours or 10 hours of usefulness, it would honestly be a huge gift if you could take 60 seconds or less, that's all I ask, to hit pause, give me a quick rating, maybe type up 1 to 2 sentences. I'm just a real person with a very small business, and I know how incredibly valuable your time is, and I know what a big ask even that 60 seconds is. So I just want to say I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So with that being said, let's get back to what happened conversations. A what happened conversation is a conversation in which everyone involved, typically this is done between 2 people, but it could be done between more. Each person gets to share their perspective on what happened. To me, as I define it, a what happened conversation has 2 parts. The first part is the talking. One person starts and they get to tell their perspective on what happened. And the second person, or if there's more than 2 people, all the other people listen. I think it can be a little confusing to talk about the first person and the second person, so I'm just going to make it specific. So let's say my husband and I are having a what happened conversation to kind of unravel some sort of tension or miscommunication we'd had. I perhaps would start by listening to his perspective as he shared with me everything he feels or experienced about what happened. So that's the first part, the talking. The second part is the repeating back. So I would then repeat back to him his perspective on what happened until I get his sign off that I have heard him correctly. Typically how this goes is that, the listener will repeat it back once and then the speaker will have corrections for you, or they'll realize that they actually have more to say about one specific part of it. So then they'll tell you all that. And then you repeat it back to them again. And then they'll either say, yeah, you got it now, or they'll perhaps even have more corrections or more things to tell you. But if you keep going, there will be a time at which they say, okay, yes, you have got it correctly. And when that happens, then you switch roles. So then in this situation, I would do the talking. I'd tell my side of the story, what happened from my perspective, and my husband would listen. And then he would repeat it back to me until I felt and signed off that he had heard me correctly. I initially got this concept of a what happened conversation from the book Difficult Conversations by Douglas Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Bean. It's a great book in general, by the way. And I have personally added the repeating back part because I find that this makes the conversations just much more effective and I think shorter in the long run, even though it's a little bit longer in the short run sometimes, if that makes sense. Because yes, you do have to repeat it back and there might be corrections and addendums. But in the long run, people feel really heard. And when they feel heard, they calm down and they're willing to collaborate. To me, a successful what happened conversation is like really cleaning out the pipes of the relationship. So there are not any blockages. You know that feeling that there's just so many blockages in the relationship, you just can't kind of get anything through. If you do this correctly, you unblock the pipes so things can just flow through without getting stopped up. So now let's talk about when a what happened conversation can be useful. The first and most obvious use case is when you're having a fight or a disagreement with anyone. As you might guess, perhaps from my examples, I do use it with my husband when we're having a disagreement, but it works with friends, with family members, with work colleagues. And if you're thinking to yourself, I can't use a formal conversational structure with this person in my life, this other person would never agree to that, or it would feel weird or whatever. Hold on a sec. I'm going to talk about that in the end as I talk about concerns and common issues. But let's just keep talking about when to use it for now. The second really powerful use case is when there is longer term issues in a relationship. I recently suggested this conversation type to a client who had had kind of resentment build up with his wife over a number of months. And when you're dealing with a long-term issue, that can be more complex in terms of what to cover in any given what happened conversation. So I'm going to speak to that more also a little later on this podcast. And then the third super useful use case is in a professional context. I have a client who is very high up the corporate ladder, and she was really exasperated with one of her direct reports, who himself was also, very high up the corporate ladder, managing a huge section of the world for this company. This direct report was just not taking feedback. She would tell him something and he would go and basically do the opposite. And it was getting pretty serious. It was getting to the point that he might have to be let go if he didn't turn it around in the next few months. And one of the tough parts of this situation was that she actually thought he was good generally. She didn't really want to let him go, but she did need to figure out how to get him to take her feedback and why he hadn't done that so far. So what happened conversation for her was a really great way to help her do that. There are 3 reasons, now that I've sort of explained to you what it is and in what situations it can be useful, I want to speak to why it's useful in all of these kinds of situations. And I think there's really 3 reasons. The first reason is, despite what we tend to want to believe, we never completely know what happened from the other person's perspective. Even if we were both in the same place during the entire duration of what happened, the other person likely noticed things that we didn't about the situation or even about us. And also, they are basically guaranteed to be interpreting the exact same facts through very different filters. And even if you know them quite well, you probably do not fully know the past experiences that are influencing their current interpretation, the mood or prioritization that's influencing their interpretation, or the implicit rules that they are implying to the situation. When I say implicit rules, I mean something like, you might have the rule, never be late to the airport. And they might have the rule, never leave any crumbs in your house that ants might find while you're on a trip. And you could see how 2 people who had very different implicit rules might interpret the same situation. Like, for example, leaving the house to go to the airport very differently. And that's maybe a more extreme example of different rules, but often these different implicit rules, which sort of guide us in interpreting a situation, we just never make them explicit. We just think they're facts about the universe. Like, well, of course you should never be late to the airport. Of course you should never leave any possibility of crumbs in the house. And you'll never actually know their implicit rules until you ask them. So that's basically a situation where maybe you were both in the exact same situation. You viewed everything at the exact same time. Far more often, you both have access to quite different information. You were not in the same room at the same time. You were in different meetings or talked to different people about different things. You genuinely know different facts. Actually, the only way you could even hope to get even close to having complete information is by asking them. So that's the first reason why a what happened conversation is very useful, because you actually don't have the full story. The second reason why a what happened conversation can be super useful is that when people feel understood, they are so much less angry and closed and defensive and so much more open to compromise. Many people will never say the explicit words, I I don't feel understood by you. But the reality is that they don't feel understood by you. And if you can help them to feel understood, you will notice the difference in terms of how they approach the conversation. They will be much, much more willing to meet you halfway or be open to your feedback. And that applies to you too. You will feel softer and more open to their feedback if you feel understood by them. So that's the second reason. And the third reason why a what happened conversation can be very useful and why it can work is that when you understand them and when they understand you, you will both be able to find a path forward much more effectively. And it will be one that meets both of your differing priorities much better. Okay, so midway review. A what happened conversation is just a conversation in which each person gets to tell their version of what happened, while the other person listens so well that they are able to repeat it back to the speaker. And then the speaker needs to sign off that the listener has understood them, and then they can switch roles. Now, in the final part of this podcast, I wanted to speak to two common concerns that I often hear about this type of conversation and how I tend to respond to those concerns. And then I want to share three common issues that I see people running into, especially my clients running into, in implementing this type of conversation and how you can avoid them. So I view this as kind of like the tips and troubleshooting portion of this podcast. So let's start with the common concerns I hear. The first common concern I hear from folks is that a what happened conversation is not going to solve all their problems. And the answer to that is yes, of course. You're totally right. A what happened conversation is just an opportunity for each of you, as fully as you can, to understand both your perspective and whoever you are in conversation with, their perspective. Sometimes a what happened conversation is all that's needed. Once you understand the other person fully, maybe there was a misunderstanding, that dissolves the tension, the pipes are degunged, everything flows through, perfect. But perhaps even more often, there will need to be some kind of problem-solving conversation to follow a what happened conversation. This is totally appropriate. You're going to need to talk about how to avoid issues like this in the future. But it can be very helpful to separate the two out, like focus on fully understanding what happened and then focus on problem solving, because you are way more likely to quickly find a solution that works well for both of you if you come to it from a place of each of you feeling fully understood and fully understanding the other person. And if you're having a what happened conversation with, for example, a direct report, like that client I mentioned earlier, what follows the what happened conversation may not be kind of like, mutual troubleshooting. It might just be, you giving them the feedback that you perhaps always needed to give them, that they are basically going to have to take. But again, giving my client as an example, my client at least could give that feedback after a what happened conversation with so much more nuance, knowing his complete side of the story and knowing that he would be much, much more receptive to actually receiving it because he would know that she understood his perspective. And it wasn't that she didn't understand him, which, always is going to make people so defensive and so closed off. So that's the first concern I hear and how I address it. The second concern I often hear from folks is just that all of this what happened conversation business is very formal. It's very structured, and they don't think it makes sense to have a formal and structured conversation in this particular case. Like, I can't do that with my, husband / mom / sibling / friend. That would be too weird. So there's two ways of addressing this. One solution is that you do not tell them that you are doing this. At least in the beginning. That would, in fact, generally be my recommendation. You don't necessarily always have to start with, let's have a formal what happened conversation. You just start doing it. You just assume the listener role. You cease trying to explain yourself or defend yourself at all. And you focus on really taking in what they have said, repeating it back to them as you go. And if you do this, you will probably notice that they start to kind of lose steam. Their shoulders relax a little bit as they keep talking. This is a very useful conversation type, by the way, if you're in the middle of an argument with someone like your spouse. Just to give an example that has never happened to me. But if you're in the middle of an argument with someone and you're both mad and it's going nowhere, if you just start listening and start really trying to understand their perspective and stop trying to explain yourself at all, You have begun the what happened conversation. And at some point in there, you could say in a really natural way, in your own words, hey, is it okay if I repeat back to you what happened from your perspective? I just want to make sure I really understand it. And then they might be like, I guess so, yeah. Because they probably really wanted you to know their perspective. That's why they've been telling it to you. And then you do that. And at the end, you ask, hey, did I get that right? Do you have any corrections for me or anything you want to add? And then they maybe add things or correct you, or maybe they don't. And maybe you keep going. You repeat back to them again and you say, okay, did I get everything this time? Is there anything that I'm missing about what happened from your end? And typically, if you've done that whole thing, and honestly, it may not even take that much time, like often even 10 minutes can do a lot. At the end, they will be much, much more relaxed. If you were in the middle of an argument, you'll likely see their shoulders relax, their breathing slow down, and they'll just seem much more calm and open to you. And then you have a choice. You might say something really casual, like, hey, is it okay if I tell you how it went from my perspective? I know it's not how you saw it. I just want you to know how I saw it. And if you've listened really well and they feel really understood, often they will be up for that. And even if they're not, even if they just kind of listen, but they don't really do it as well as you did, if you don't feel comfortable saying more or explaining more suggestions about how to do this, even all of that, all that's happened in this very sort of implicit, informal way, you probably kind of saved the conversation just by taking a lot of the anger out, just by really listening to their experience. So that's one approach. If you just really feel that you could not bring up anything about having a structured conversation. The slightly, barely more structured version of this would still be to do that thing where you don't even tell them you're starting to have a what happened conversation. You just start listening, you let them get their steam out. And then when it's time to switch roles, if you feel like they could handle a little more guidance, you just share a tiny bit more with them at that point, after you listen to them, when they're likely to be receptive, right? You just say something like, hey, could I share my perspective? And would it be okay if you didn't explain or defend yourself during that time? Just like I did. And would it be okay if you just kind of listened and then you repeated it back to me just like I did for you? So that's just the teensiest bit of guidance in a moment when, like I said, they're probably pretty receptive, because we're all so much more receptive when we've been well listened to. And the third option would be to say that, sometimes we actually can speak explicitly about the type of conversation we want to have. Yes, it might feel a little weird if you've never done it before, and it might feel a little awkward, but honestly, it's a pretty simple concept. You can probably explain it in just a few sentences. It doesn't have to be this big dramatic thing. You could just kind of say to whoever you're talking to, hey, I know we're both, mad right now, or both feeling resentful, or whatever it is. I heard about this thing that we could do that might help us both feel better. Would you be willing to try it? Here's how it works. And again, if you suggest that you assume the listener role first, which, let's be clear, is the harder role, because man, can it be hard to just listen and not defend or explain yourself, then you can kind of model to them how to do it. And it usually just goes better that way by the time you switch roles. So that's the second common objection I hear, and what I tend to suggest in response. So now that we've addressed those common objections or concerns, I wanted to talk about the top three kind of problems or tricky situations I see my clients running into as they try to implement this. The first common problem is that in some situations, there can be a lot of what happened to discuss. Like maybe resentment has been piling up for 3 years, 5 years in your relationship. The solution to this is going to depend on the people involved. For some situations, a powerhouse 2-hour, 2.5 hour, maybe even 3-hour conversation, maybe you just get it all done and that feels good. But maybe you can't get it all done in that amount of time. Or maybe 2 or 2.5 or 3 hours is just too much. In that case, my suggestion is to just find some ways to, put boundaries on the conversation. So tonight, we're going to discuss everything that happened in 2020, and then we'll do 2021. And then, next Saturday, we're going to do 2022. Or we'll start in this conversation talking about our trip to visit your parents. And then next week, we're going to talk about, how Thanksgiving went. And then the week after, we're going to talk about, the conflict that we had about chores 3 weeks ago. For me, Sometimes it can feel nicer to start with the older stuff, like kind of clean that up so the water runs through those pipes. I often think about resentment in a relationship as kind of like things that gunk up the pipes, as you can tell. And then you can like move closer to the present from the past, but you can segment it really in any way that feels right to you. This is just me reminding you that if it feels like too much, you don't have to do it all in one conversation. The second common problem I typically see is resentfulness by one partner, that their conversational partner would never do this for them. Like, why am I always the one improving our communication? I most often hear this concern in romantic relationships, especially more serious, longer term ones like marriages. And look, I am going to be really clear with you. I think this is a tricky issue. I think it often points to larger resentment in the relationship that might be useful to look at and untangle. The resentfulness is probably not just about, being the one who does more conversational work. And I will say also life coaching can be very helpful for this, by the way, if you'd like to work with me. But the perspective that I would offer you today is, honestly, I think this is for you. This is so you can feel good. So my recommendation is that I wouldn't make it a problem if you are the one who brings this up. Like, let yourself be doing this for 100% selfish reasons. Just because it feels good to you to have water flowing smoothly through the pipes, to not have so much tension in your relationship. And as you hopefully improve the relationship, I think there could be openings to address larger issues of resentment. So that speaks to the second common issue. The third and final common issue I see, and this one is by far the most common issue I see people doing when they struggle to implement an effective what happened conversation, is that people struggle to actually listen and understand, to really stay in that listener role. And they will start explaining their own perspective or defending their own actions when they're really supposed to be listening and just understanding the other person's perspective. And let me be really clear. It is hard to just listen. It is very, very, very tempting to defend and explain yourself when you are supposed to be just listening to what they think happened. You are going to be thinking to yourself, but they don't know the whole story. They totally don't get this thing that I know. They're misunderstanding. And look, you're not wrong. They are misunderstanding. But for now, you need to know how they see it, totally and completely. You need to not interrupt them, and you will get your chance to explain. And if you explain first and now they're explaining it, but you want another turn, that's totally fine. You can go back and have another go once they're done. You can switch turns multiple times if you want. You will have your turn as many times as you need to. You just cannot have your say in the middle of them having their say. It's just so helpful to separate it out. So that is the third problem that I commonly see. And that brings me to the end of this podcast, of all that I wanted to say about what happened conversations. And I want to be really authentic with you. I do use this conversational structure a lot in my life, but I don't always do it. It's not like I, never interrupt someone in the middle of them sharing their perspective to share my perspective or defend myself. It doesn't always have to be so formal. But also, if you are in the middle of a very thorny situation and you just drop into a what happened conversation, even without telling them, you would be amazed at how much more quickly the whole thing might resolve itself. So that is all that I have to share about what happened conversations. I hope this is helpful. And as always, I am rooting for you. Take care, everyone. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.